So now I am going to introduce Keith Miriam, who is Technical Director of Processing with Tech Resources, who will walk us through the GeoMet guideline, the GeoMet white paper that is going to be going into a final review. Keith?
Okay, thanks. So just for everyone's understanding, this is a white paper that's still in review. The draft will be shared. We'd like you to note any issues that you see along in the white paper in the forms provided. We'll evaluate the recommendations, go through an editing period, and then have this review or this white paper finalized. You can advance the slide. So one of the things that happened very quickly was that the GMG group pulled together a series of internationally recognized experts and practitioners from almost every discipline that plays a role in the geometallurgical process, from both the operator's perspective as well as the service provider's perspective. So we had, I'll call it a star-studded team, but a team of people who are very knowledgeable in the area. Surprisingly, one of the first things that we came across was the fact that we could not answer a simple question and agree on the answer. And that question is, what is GeoMet? That's not due to lack of knowledge from the groups or lack of practice. That was largely due to the fact that we've each had a piece of the process of GeoMet in our own domain. We've each had a particular perspective from the projects that we've undertaken, as well as the companies we've worked in order to go through a GeoMet process that was fit for purpose. When you take a step back and you start talking about the GeoMet process, it becomes apparent that it's an iterative process that takes information from a number of different disciplines and continually builds upon that information in a way that takes not just the data that's standardly produced in project development, but provides meaning to the teams and the companies that then execute on the projects. So the answer to the question is on the screen, but essentially what it is it's the combination of geological, mineralogical, mining, metallurgical, environmental, and economic data provided in a way that we can be predictive about future operations and outcomes and add surety to our business processes. So this white paper was almost a white paper by accident in an attempt to make sure that we all understood and we're talking about the same thing when we were talking about GeoMet. That allowed us to make sure that we were very clear in our intent and brought alignment together with the team. So I think the process as we went through was a tiny bit difficult, but at the end, everyone agreed that it was much, much clearer. And I myself learned something through the process. Heather, if you could advance to the next slide. Okay, so what will this white paper do? So the white paper is intended to describe what GeoMet is, and provide an outline of a series of guidelines that will likely be developed in order to define this space. The space is highly requested by the industry for more information and guidance, but it's complex. So we do need to break this up into a series of smaller bite-sized guidelines, or essentially you would end up with a textbook. The other thing that this is intended to do, and this was something that I was particularly passionate about, was making sure that we wrote this in such a way that someone who maybe just came out of school and had heard GeoMet and maybe had had a day's worth of classwork in GeoMet, but didn't really have a deep understanding, could use this as a tool to help them in the development of their own practice of geometallurgy within their own organization. So the intent here is not to speak to the people who already know or speak to the people who participated. The intent here is to speak to the people who might not have participated, but also provide clarity for the entire spectrum of knowledge holders. If you could advance to the next slide. Things that are out of scope. We very clearly wanted to make sure that we weren't trying to provide a guideline for the entire practice of mining and operating and through the course of the value chain. There are established geological practices, mineralogical practices, metallurgical process practices, environmental sampling practices, and mine planning practices that are important to get right and feed into the geometallurgical process, but we wanted to draw a line to make sure that we're not talking about those practices in this guideline. We're talking about how the information from those practices is used to add meaning and value. If you could advance the slide, please. So I'm going to try and go quickly now, being aware of time. We developed 8 areas that were important. The first one is common data reporting. Sorry. I think we should actually be on representative sampling. There we go. Thank you. So the first one was representative sampling. Now, this is something that is handled standardly through your geomet teams and how they drill the deposits, or your geology teams, how they drill the deposits, your metallurgy teams and your mineralogy teams and how they select core for subsequent test work. But there are also particulars around not only spatially how you would cover the areas or how you would cover the areas for variability sampling, but also how you would select samples based on characteristics that through early stage work you understand are important for your deposit. So we wanted to make sure that we had a guide to allowing representative sampling that considers not just your standard geological approaches, but considers all of the points that are involved in geometallurgy. If you can advance to the next slide. Now we're in geological characterization. So once you have the samples, there's a couple of stages here. The first stage usually that happens in your first iteration is someone has found some very interesting mineralization, but there's no process work. So the first thing that happens is there's a significant amount of geological characterization that goes on. That is then used to inform subsequent processes. The second time, after you've been through the geomet process once, the second time you now have metallurgical, environmental, and financial information that feeds back into your sample selection and may adjust how you look at the geological characterization. If you could advance to the next slide, please. The next slide is metallurgical and environmental characterization. So between geology and metallurgy, there's a mineralogy step that occurs kind of within both areas of practice. But the intent here is this is where you gather information around things like hardness, recovery, concentrate quality, impurities, regrind requirements, process flow sheet design, those sorts of things. Oftentimes in these programs, you're also generating the sample that is used to characterize the environmental performance for things like NAG and PAG and ARD potential. So that's specific to the tailings. Some of the environmental work also comes from the geological program based on characterizing waste stockpiles, but we wanted to make sure that once we had the samples, we were very clear about what guidance we would provide in terms of how the information should be brought forward into the geomet process from these two characterization styles. You could advance the slide, please. The next slide is about data consolidation and data quality assurance. Inside each of the practices that I've talked about, there is data validation, there's QA/QC, there's a large series of steps taken to ensure that data that is erroneous for one reason or another is removed, checked, the data that you have is validated to a certain degree. One of the things that's unique to Geomet is you bring together disparate data about usually points within your spatial deposit from a wide range of sources into a single database that is then used to build models. Making sure that the process of bringing that data in and attributing it to a particular location is its own step and stage. And it's a very important one in terms of how you consolidate the data, how you ensure that the data is of a quality and correct, and the data is attributed correctly so that it can be appropriately used in model development. You could advance to the next slide. Model development, no surprise that that's next on the list. So we develop geological models, we develop mine plan models, we develop metallurgical inputs often to these models. We often develop specific models for recovery, concentrate quality, hardness that are material to throughput and economic outputs. So all of these models, typically in a geomet environment, tend to be consolidated into a small subset of models, depending on the software or the techniques used by the particular practitioners or company, or sometimes they can actually be brought into one large model. So developing these models has its own series of tricks. It has its own series of dangers and risks that need to be addressed. In the paper, you'll see we talk about the N+1 approach, and that's an attempt to describe the iterative approach without causing you trauma from previous educational experiences with iterative approaches in the N+1 concept. But essentially, what we want to make sure is as we're going through, and typically there's an exploration phase, a scoping phase, a pre-feas phase, a feas phase, and an execution phase, where you're gathering more and more information, either through better definition of the deposit, infill drilling, or through other means, potentially better metallurgical understanding. So it's very important to understand how those models need to be updated and understanding the changes in assumptions as they feed into the decision-making process for process plant design or project configuration or economic evaluation later on in the model development. Next slide, if you could. Model evaluation is another step that is very important and sometimes not handled in a way that we would like it to be handled. The old saying, trust but verify, holds here. We build a lot of models and we can become enamored with the mathematics and the intelligence that was applied to the developing them, but we must make sure that they make sense. They have to be able to predict to a value that is understood. So there needs to be, in some cases, recovery. So you have a recovery model and you have a point sample that the recovery of from test work. So you should be able to take the inputs to that model and validate that the recovery that the model you've developed broadly for the deposit is reasonably accurate for that point location, or all of the point locations, or the point locations in a particular zone within the deposit. So that's a very important process that we think needs to be addressed. If you could advance to the next slide, please. Project optimization. This is where kind of the rubber meets the road in terms of what does this information mean in terms of the project. And this is where we put up the N+1 just to give everybody that moment of pause. All of this work that we've talked about to this point is typically in service of a project design. That includes a mine plan, that includes fleet sizing for equipment, that includes a process plant design and costing, as well as operating costs. You may go through this process the first time, design a plant, including how you would handle placement of material to address any environmental issues that you've determined through the testing process, and you may come up with a value that is not acceptable to your company from either a free cash flow or an NPV perspective. In which case, you may, based on what you find high cost, complex, or for another reason, determine that you want to go back and optimize your design based on the information that you have. So there's a series of steps that are done that are a small iterative loop within the project design side that will often drive you to a better economic outcome through changes in the design, potentially changes in mining areas or assumptions about the deposit. some of those learnings are going to be very important to carry through to the next stage. So those learnings about what is important and what drives your project value or degrades your project value will often drive you to select specific locations within the ore deposit to provide better definition so that you can determine waste and ore better, or to provide more sample into a program in order to develop a process that addresses those unique considerations for that material type. So the project optimization is an important step, and this is really the point of the rest of the work. If you could advance to the next slide. Lastly is reconciliation. The way that I've been talking about this is sort of a greenfield approach. Someone finds a shiny rock, they do some drilling, they do some test work, they design a plant, they have an economic outcome that they find fantastic, and that justifies building the project. One of the important things in the practice of geometallurgy is, while that seems to be where it was first picked up and developed over the last 20 years, we're now seeing it move into the operational space in a significant way. It often used to be that whatever test work you did or whatever project design you did, there was a hard break between the project team and the operations team, and the operations team created a new reality based on the information that they pulled from the deposit. What's happening now is, because of the work that has been done and the body of knowledge and the density of knowledge provided through the geomet process, there's a significant collaboration between the geomet teams and the operations in order to drive operational success. So taking the information that we get from the process and reconciling those models and all of that work that was done back to the deposit so that we can adjust our understanding of future outcomes is an important process. There's a filtering process here because sometimes the plant isn't being operated in an optimized way. So you have to be careful about that. But again, that's part of the reconciliation process. So overall, reconciliation being the weird piece, oftentimes we go through this in an iterative approach, as I've said, tied to project stages, tied to information delivery, and tied to economic evaluations. It is actually possible that you may go back and iterate some or all of this process, these 8 steps that we've talked about, depending on your business processes and the learnings and the value of the project that you determine. That's the short outcome. Hopefully I was within time.